All right, I heard you had a pretty exciting morning, and we're going to keep the momentum up. We're going to be talking about the future of Fifth Avenue, and guess where we are? We're on Fifth Avenue, so what a perfect place to have this discussion. So please welcome Bert Barnes, the Director of Sustainability for The Real Real, Samata Pattinson, the founder and CEO of Black Pearl, and Adele Stafford, the Executive Vice President of Growth at Worldly. Welcome. So, you know, our lifestyles are responsible for about 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. So what we choose to buy, how we consume, 2/3, right? So that's a significant amount. Fashion, of course, being a key piece of that. So the dialogue that we want to have today is, what is the future of sustainable fashion? Where do we see momentum? Where are some obstacles that we need to consider to figure out how we start overcoming those? So we're going to get kind of into it right away. So let me just start, Samata, with you. You are an expert in sustainable fashion. You're an advisor to some of the biggest celebrities and influencers in the world, including Billie Eilish, and responsible for a lot of her sustainability principles and how she shows up, particularly on the fashion space. So can you talk about the shifts that you're seeing across culture and how they're helping to drive more sustainable consumption? And in particular, how is digitization helping this trend accelerate?
Okay, thank you for that question. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for your time. So I would say when I first started working in this space, I came in as someone who had a kind of design background, very much, you know, just interested in fashion as a sense of identity and self-expression. And I essentially tripped into the sustainable fashion space. And that was maybe about 10 years ago. But what I noticed then was that the perception of what sustainable fashion was a hindrance to how citizens engaged and interacted with it. If you'd used the word sustainable fashion maybe 10 years ago, there was a perception that that means a hemp bag, you know, a grass skirt, and someone on a beach kind of like swaying in the wind. And so people didn't have a connection with how they could connect or purchase or even buy into that kind of space because it was limited in how it was being kind of seen. Over the years, I ran a project with the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, aka the Oscars. And so every year, my role was to identify a sustainable fashion trend, engage with a talent or a celebrity, and then ask them to wear something that was a sustainable fashion piece. And through that, we started to see a broadening of the definition of what sustainable fashion was. So now we're understanding, oh, it's vintage. It's going back to what exists because we're already producing so much. It's secondhand. It's buying clothes made from certain materials, you know, whether that's plant-based or whether those are recycled alternatives. So suddenly it's expanding. And then it continued to expand. So every year we were kind of thinking about how can we better represent the conversation so that someone sitting at home watching the Oscars, seeing a beautiful piece or suit could say, well, how can I participate? And then it became, oh, I can go and support like a BIPOC brand, or I can, you know, do these different things, or I can customize something. So I've seen that expand, and like you said, people like Billie, they've used their platform to have conversations with their fans to say, you know, how do you approach clothes? And they're getting answers. Oh, well, I like the idea of Stella McCartney, but I also don't have that affordability, so what's the solution for me? Or, you know, I live in this area, so where can I go and buy it? And so we're having these really great conversations about the solutions, the brands, what the label means, and all of these different things. And so I'm really excited. I think there's a lot of opportunity to broaden the definition of sustainability and sustainable fashion so that more people feel they can participate in it.
Well, I know at Mastercard we are thrilled that there are icons like Billie who are helping educate, you know, kind of the world and society about what is sustainable in fashion, how it can impact society, how it can help all of us with our expression as well. So Bert, you know, at The Real Real, which is luxury resale essentially, what's the market like? Like, how are you seeing the pickup for your business and for resale in luxury?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, for having all of us here. It's been a great week so far. I mean, all the data that we see indicates that resale in apparel is poised to continue growing really quickly. Our friends at ThredUp actually put out a great resale report every year, And this year's report included some really compelling statistics, namely that the secondhand apparel market globally is expected to grow at 3 times the rate of the overall global apparel market through 2028. And the US market alone with an 11% CAGR expected. So really significant. And I think what we see now, to Samata's point, is consumers are more educated, more cognizant now more than ever about the environmental impacts of their purchasing decisions. And there are really clear signals and ways for us to tell consumers what those impacts are. We know that resale is a really powerful way to decarbonize and otherwise minimize the environmental impacts of your wardrobe. And so we, at The Real, one of the things we do that's like very consumer facing and more resonant on an individual level is we have this thing, the sustainability calculator, which basically takes comparative life cycle assessment data from brand new items relative to resold items and gives you on the PDPs and our member portal like a water use and greenhouse gas emissions avoided for each item based on the type, taxon, and materials used. So, you know, I think what we see is that resale is becoming more and more embedded in the apparel landscape. And I think that's like a different framing of kind of looking at the hard, gritty numbers. It used to be, consignment used to be like highly localized, used to be considered somewhat niche, and now it's just this really important part of the apparel market. And so that's very exciting to us at The Real. I'm sure it's very exciting to everyone here in the room, and we're excited about that.
Oh, we are as well, and I think your calculator is so interesting. We have the Mastercard Carbon Calculator. It's part of our strategy to inspire, inform, and enable more sustainable consumption. And you know, you always wonder, so you kind of represent, Samata, the inspire piece, right? Finding icons to symbolize this and create momentum for it, and then the inform that The Real is bringing with the label. But Adele, your company's all about bringing data-driven insights to this topic. So tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing.
Yeah, thank you also for, am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Can you hear me now? Great, excellent. Thank you for having me as well. So Worldly is a bit of an interesting and unique data platform in the apparel and footwear space because we represent a standard and shared methodology that was developed by a group of apparel brands about 15 years ago and has now grown into a collective of 350 mostly apparel and footwear brands and multi-category retailers, and 50,000 suppliers in the supply chain, in the apparel and footwear supply chain predominantly. And so we collect, we're known for collecting primary data, both throughout the value chain, both environmental and human rights data, as well as material data and product level data. So we are really serving up the hardcore, gritty, kind of complex numbers to all of these brands and retailers that are, you know, on the hook to essentially report out to stakeholders, including consumers, on an annual basis. And it's been really interesting to see this like group of you know, fierce competitors sort of lay down their swords, recognizing that there wasn't really going to, they weren't going to make it. There was not going to really, you know, they weren't going to be able to achieve the level of impact reduction without this collective action. And I'll say that I think the apparel and footwear industry is particularly progressive, again, and kind of unique in that way. We don't really see that across other industries in the same way. So again, we provide the data and the analysis, and brands really use that in 2 ways predominantly, to set up impact reduction programs. So for example, let's say a brand is wanting to develop a coal phase-out program with a group of strategic suppliers. We give them the data that helps them identify those suppliers, make those reductions, track those reductions, and then report out on those reductions. And then obviously for compliance and reporting purposes, regulation, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, is heating up. And so there's a lot of pressure, especially coming out of the EU, on all of these brands to report out. And we are a huge source of that very important primary data.
Yeah, I don't think our ESG controller's in the room, but we are just as much focused on the EU CSRD, all these fabulous regulations that are coming out of Europe. So lots to do there. So, one of the things that we talk a lot about inside Mastercard is we're thinking about how we can help enable this transition to a more sustainable, regenerative economy is how do you sell it, right? Like, what's the messaging that really resonates? Because you have probably a small group of people who are really excited about the sustainability of what they're buying, wearing, or re-wearing. So maybe, Bert, like, how do you think about how you're positioning sustainability as part of your value proposition? Do you lead with it? Is it, and by the way, it's also this? Like, what do you think about what works and what you've learned so far about the messaging?
It's a great question. We don't necessarily lead with sustainability. I mean, it's been a part of the company since its inception. But historically, I think green and sustainable products have trouble sustaining traction unless they're more effective, prettier, tastier, whatever. And so we take lessons from that. And a lot of the brands, I think, that come to mind for me when I think about green products, they fall under that category. It's not some sustainable product that is not superior to the incumbents. And the same is true at The RealReal. 49% of our members cite extending the life cycle of luxury goods as a primary driver for shopping with us. And that's really exciting, right? It's something that it's a big part of my job is trying to get that number up, essentially, is by communicating with consumers. But that also means that greater than 50% of our members prioritize something else as a primary driver. So getting a great deal, finding something they can't find somewhere else, variety, the thrill of seeing what drops every day. And so for that reason, we're not super sensitive about our customers' sustainability sentiments and how they kind of wax and wane in little ways over time, because at the end of the day, our members don't really have to care about sustainability for us to keep doing the work that we want to do. And ultimately, the more business we do, the more items we're keeping out of landfill, the fewer brand new items we're theoretically keeping from being consumed, and the more we're growing our little slice of the circular economy.
Yeah, and Samata, from where you sit, do you see, how are you thinking about the messaging of this, particularly with the influencers you work with?
Yeah, and I have thoughts on that. I think it's a really good question, because I think what we have to do, even though we're talking about sustainability, is we can tap into the fact that this is an interesting space that delivers interesting solutions. And I think that a lot of the time, so what we do is we try and connect the dots between themes and topics that are actually just of interest to people or their passions. And I found that I give Billy as a case study, but I'd rather give another example. So earlier this year, I wrote the Sustainable Style Guide for the Oscars, and it was everybody coming, used it as a reference point, how can we show up? And we touched on different things. We touched on things that kind of illuminated how maybe certain materials are linked to plastics in the ocean. We touched on things like, supporting indigenous designers, and people found that interesting. So I think we can wear the subject of sustainability too heavily and not recognize that there's an opportunity for an interesting conversation. And that to me connects to the information touch points like the label. Right now it's very difficult to find a consolidated story about an item. Even if you wanted to kind of find out how is this item sustainable, you've got the label, you've got the website, you've got the CSR report, you've got to go all of these different places. And I think the opportunity for things like the digital product passport and so on is that you suddenly have an opportunity to storytell a garment in a very visceral and emotive way. It was made here by these women, this was what it's made from, this is why we made that choice. But there's also an opportunity to be honest. And what I've seen, especially with Billy's fans, we have a climate festival we do called Overheated. When they come up afterwards and they're asking questions, they always say, I would love these brands to be a bit more honest. And I know that maybe brands will suddenly kind of have a panic attack. But what they mean is, right, they're like, oh, how honest can we be? But what they mean is recognize that sustainability is the pursuit of something, but there is no perfect solution that exists right now. And if we can have that conversation and say, these are our strengths, this is where we're doing really well, and this is where there's space for growth, and that's part of the transparency, then it becomes a conversation they really want to have. And that's what I've seen across the demographics, from Billy's fans to people who are coming to the awards, you know, like in the later stages of their life, and they're like, I didn't even know this was a conversation I could be interested in. So I think that's how we tend to approach it. Like, there is a value conversation, but it doesn't have to be so worthy. It doesn't have to be that we are here to make you feel bad about how things are going and you are not worthy enough if you're not making these choices. It can be inspiring as well.
Yeah, and I think we've definitely seen the data around that, right? Leaning into the positive, leaning into the optimism of how you can be part of the solution. So really excited about that work. So we have a lot of government officials and policymakers here in the room. So if we think about that aspect of, you know, what do you think is needed in the fashion space around policy? So yeah, Adele, do you want to start kind of with your thoughts?
Yeah, I also just want to touch on what you just said around the honesty bit. It's interesting. I was just talking to Bert about this. You know, I think what I've seen over the last 3 to 5 years is an increasing trend to be pretty sober about the realities of where we are in terms of meeting our goals or not meeting our goals, and really doubling down on that collective action. And I think that's really encouraging. And we're certainly seeing that as regulation comes into place. So getting into regulation, you know, what we're hearing from brands right now is everything from like, we've got it, we're organized, to complete sheer panic. Around how to think about things like double materiality for CSRD, CS-triple-D. You've got the digital product passport. You've got PEF, if that will ever take real shape. You've got the French eco-label, which actually is quite interesting alongside the digital product passport, because you are talking then about a product level label that does really go into substantial sort of metrics around the true environmental and social and labor components of an actual garment and a product. I think the number one thing I would say to folks who are involved in regulation is involve industry stakeholders in the conversation and the process. It's really important that we are seeing a clear picture of a product's true impact, and your industry experts are the people who can guide you around what really matters in terms of these actual outputs. The other thing I would say is don't forget about the suppliers. There is still so much inequity in this system, and we often talk about like what's good for the brand and how is the brand sort of managing the message, but the suppliers are, you know, really struggling to make the changes that actually matter in terms of real material reductions. So making sure that those folks are also very much involved and engaged in the conversation, because at the end of the day, this all pushes down onto them.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It came from a breakfast this morning where we spent a lot of time talking about compliance versus innovation and the effect of all of the compliance, particularly on kind of the small businesses, the providers, you know, downstream in supply chains, and the extraordinary kind of cost and burden that this is bringing, you know, and how do we help them? How do we make sure that they can continue to function their businesses and continue to innovate?
Yeah.
So back to the policy piece. Samata, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I maybe just add on to that, because I've worked with smaller brands and I've worked with some of the largest household names within the apparel industry. And I think that sometimes when it comes, especially to like digitization and this idea of maybe like the digital product passport, which is such a good example for this conversation, there's this maybe perception that there's a reluctance for it, but actually, like, you know, that people are doing it because it's legislation that's coming down the pipeline, so they have to. But actually what I've seen is people are excited to do that. They're just nervous about understanding the technology and navigating it and finding the resources to implement it. And as we all know, you know, with technology, you know, there's always the unforeseen. So they're considering, well, how do you localize it? You know, the number of fashion websites that I've been to, and it's like, there's no language translator tool. You know, how do you localize it? How do you kind of consider those factors? So I see that there's an interest there. So there has to be perhaps some programs or some training or some initiatives to really capacity build so that people who want to engage know how to, and also have access to the resources to support them and facilitate that development. And then another thing that I think we haven't quite got right is what the food industry has got right. You know, we haven't had that educational, like, public awareness campaign or that initiative that really helps citizens understand and be excited to engage with these solutions. And that could be anything from like incentivizing it through vouchers or through initiatives or through point systems, but there could be a way that we get citizens to participate in apparel items that are using DPB, and just getting them excited about that. And I think that to me is a space I feel passionately about, because educating citizens to ask the right questions and be excited about the solutions means that our industry as a whole can move in a good direction. So I think those are potentially some areas to look at. And of course, like, you know, there have to be penalties. As we know with the Fashion Act, you know, that has to be part of it, because, you know, for some the stick, for some the carrot.
Yeah. Well, the point systems that you mentioned, that's something we definitely know about at Mastercard. So
yes,
very excited about
Just
working with our
plug
loyalty team on that. So to end on kind of the optimistic note of where are we going, where do we want to be going? Maybe let's just go down the line. Bert, like, what are you optimistic about? What do you hope to see in the future of Fifth Avenue?
I mean, I would hope to see a holistic approach that prioritizes innovation but embraces policy. I think Adele and Samata hit on this, but approaches should be kind of coordinated across the value chain, and it shouldn't just be brands, or it shouldn't just be companies like The RealReal who kind of sit in a position where, you know, we're reselling things that are already, we're not directly in touch with those supply chains, but we have touch points with the consumer. And similarly, it shouldn't be just driven by regulation, but in pushing for policy advances, which we do, it should also be cognizant of kind of the like reporting burden that I think a lot of folks have felt across different brands and not just within fashion. And we're seeing like a lot of consolidation of that now, which is super helpful. But I think the whole approach should be holistic, and we should try to think about it to the extent that we can, not just in, you know, state or national terms, I guess.
Great. Samata.
I love that. I would say two things. I would say what gives me hope is what I hope to see is like the mass adoption of the true circular economy, because I think that it's complementary to production, but it's this idea that a high street, or, you know, as we call it in the UK, a high street where you have an extended and deep relationship with your brand because they have designed for you to have a continuing relationship with the product they made you. And that to me is the new luxury. It's the idea that it used to be this purchase of this item that was luxury, and now luxury is an extended relationship with not just the item but with the brand. So when you have the ability to go into a store and kind of get a technical washing of a garment, or get it remade or upcycled or repurposed, and you can walk away with that, not only is that a revenue stream for the business, but it's also extending the relationship you have with the product and with the, you know, with the company itself. So to me, like a circular economy which celebrates new items but also values the fact that we want our citizens to have a deep relationship with their items, not least because when you hold on to an item for at least 9 months, you reduce your carbon waste and water footprint by 20 to 30%. Like, there's real metric change behind that. And the last thing I would say is it would be good to celebrate the culture of sustainability and recognize that for lots of people, these solutions we're coming up with are not new ideas. You know, the mending, the so-and-so. Let's tap into that. We have a global multicultural population out there. So if we can kind of connect the dots between someone who has a pre-loved sari and what you're doing in your store, or somebody whose mother gave them a story about a garment and you're telling them a similar story, that can be really powerful. Yeah.
Fantastic. Adele.
I love that. Thank you. I think, you know, 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference with about 600 sustainability leaders from the apparel and footwear industry. And the common rallying cry was really around equal partnership between brands and suppliers, and just a lot more, I think, focus and visibility around suppliers. I mean, if 90% of your garment's impact is coming from the supply chain, specifically tier 2 back to tier 4 in the supply chain, this has to change. And I'm seeing a true sea change, and that just gives me so much optimism, because that's where the real hard work of reductions is going to take place.
Amazing. Well, sitting here with the three of you, I'm optimistic about where we're headed. I think, you know, from where we sit kind of at the center of the global economy, this transition, right, that we're all working toward, to have, you know, businesses who are scaling, who are creating new markets for resale, that's fantastic. You know, the way that you're working with influencers all the way down to the detailed information that you're trying to share to educate, and of course the data that's all behind that. All very important things. I'm very optimistic about the future of Fifth Avenue. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.